Pine Gulch, Wyoming, spring 1878. The market lot breathed heat and dust. Bells on cattle collars chimed in uneven time. A locomotive whistle carried in from the flats. Boards creaked under boots. The air tasted of iron nails, horse sweat, and frying fat. Nobody looked up when the stagecoach shuddered to a stop. They were bargaining over beef and salt. They were keeping their faces turned from trouble. Nora Hale stepped down first. 19. Linen dress once white, now the gray of ash brushed thin over snow. The hem had learned the language of dirt. She touched the doorframe because her legs trembled, then let go before anyone could see it. Her hair had fallen from its pins and stranded along her cheekbones. She did not bring a bag. She carried her breath like it might spill. Edwin Hale, her father, followed. His cravat was askew. A soft man trying to stand hard. He did not offer Nora his arm. He fussed with a receipt in his pocket, then gave up and rubbed his jaw as if he had grown a bruise there. He made for the corral without looking back. The Harlan stock sign hung above the rails, letters big and black. A smaller board swung beside it. No open flame near hay. Wade Harlan waited with his thumbs inside his belt. He had the look of a man who bought things and named it law. His shirt carried a bloom of old whiskey at the collar. His boots were expensive and unkind. A folded document stuck from his coat like a tongue. He did not nod at Edwin. He stared past him to the girl. Edwin tried for a gentleman's sound and lost it. "She reads," he said. "Figures, numbers, French a little." Wade cut him off with a palm. "I do not hire a clerk. I do not buy talk." He opened the paper with 2 fingers. The words were plain and hungry. Contract of marriage witnessed by nobody that mattered. Edwin's hand shook while he signed. Ink blotted on Hale. Wade signed in a quick line and smiled at the way his name held the page. He looked at Nora the way men look at livestock they have already paid for. "Cheap is easy," he said. "Broken learns faster." Nora did not answer. Her mouth made the smallest shape and then closed. Wind blew grit against her teeth. A boy ran by with a red kite tied to twine. The kite snagged on Harlan's stock and shivered. The boy tugged and tugged until the twine hummed. Nobody helped him. The kite finally tore loose and drifted crooked. Cole Mercer was near the hitching rail with a leather pouch of salve in his hand. A black mare stood hip-shot beside him and watched the crowd the way horses do when men argue. Cole was tall where it did not matter and quiet where it did. A scar traveled up the right side of his neck and vanished into his collar like a bad road into fog. He carried himself like he had learned to move after pain. He kept his mouth closed because it kept everything else steady. Nora felt the weight of his gaze before she found his face. It was a steady weight that did not press. He did not lift his chin. He did not look away. She held the look for a heartbeat longer than polite. It felt like the first drink of water that does not burn. Wade jerked his head at the freight wagon. "Time to earn your keep, girl." He caught Nora's elbow with 2 fingers that pretended to be gentle. She walked because she had taught herself that moving hurts less than being dragged. The wagon door swung on a rough hinge and struck her hip. Something soft gave way at her wrist. A white ribbon slipped free of her cuff and fell into the dirt. Cole saw it land. He bent as if he were checking a cinch and picked up the ribbon with the hand that did not shake. He brushed grit from it with his thumb. He folded it once and slid it into the inside pocket of his coat close to heart. No one watched him do it. He did not look at Nora again. The wind carried the wagon west along a road the color of bone. Harlan land began where the grass gave up and the wire fences began to repeat. The ranch was a long sprawl of boards, blisters, and nail heads. A windmill ticked a loose blade. The barn leaned into itself. The house sat high on stones that had settled like tired knees. A cottonwood tree stood near the porch dead to the last twig. Nora climbed down and touched ground that did not welcome. Hands that were not Wade's pulled her past the porch. The men smelled of sweat gone rancid in cloth. Their spurs clicked at odd times. They did not meet her eyes. It was not the first time they had carried a body that did not resist. The storage room waited with its single truth. No window. The smell of rust and mouse droppings. A lantern hooked from a nail and tilted like it had been hung in anger. The flame inside made a mean light. Ropes hung from pegs and lines that suggested order. A shovel leaned in the corner, brown at the handle where wood met iron. Beside it, a rake with a broken tooth. Sacks of feed slumped open and slept. Wade filled the doorway and chewed on nothing. "You sleep when I say. You eat if I remember. You speak when you are spoken to." His voice had a lull in it where a kind man might place comfort. He let the lull stay empty. Nora kept her eyes on a knot in the plank behind him. The knot looked like an eye that had closed too long ago. "Speak," Wade said. She did not. He snorted like a mule that has been asked for grace. Already taught. Good. He slid a bar into an iron bracket and let it fall. Metal on metal. A sound like a lid finding a pot. Boots went away. Voices carried and thinned. A fly droned blind circles. Nora sat on the edge of a crate and placed her hands flat beside her hips. She waited until her breath forgot to shake. The lantern popped and quieted. Men talked in the hallway later. Laughs with no joy in them. One voice said boss says cracked is cheap and does not argue. Another said cheaper than hiring a wife. Their mirth made more dust than sound. Nora studied the seam where the door met the jamb. The wood was old and tired. She slid to the floor and pressed her ear to the gap. Cool air moved there like a secret. She found a splinter on the side of a crate and worked it free with her nails. It stabbed the pad of her thumb. She did not let go. Blood beaded and made the wood dark and slippery. She used the sharp point to worry at the iron loop that held the bar. A bad tool in a bad hand can still make a change. She breathed slow so the splinter would not break. The room was close and hot. The smell of mouse and mold wrapped her nose. She set her jaw and made the smallest scrape. Then another. Then a sound she had not known she was waiting for. The iron rasped a little against itself. The bar moved a breath's width. She stopped and listened. It settled again. Outside, somewhere near the porch, a hammer struck a nail. Somewhere farther, a coyote sent up a long thread of sound. Nora's own breath counted her to 10. She put the splinter back to the loop and bit the inside of her cheek. The taste of salt woke her mouth. Her hands shook and then obeyed. The bar lifted a fraction. She could feel it through the splinter and her skin. She pinched the splinter tight and pulled again. A tiny click answered. She shut her eyes and did not pray. She only counted the space between sounds. On the other side of the door, the hook latch shifted. Metal scraped. Close. The metal scraped again. The latch lifted a hair. Nora held the splinter steady and breathed through her teeth so the sound of it would not ride the air. The bar shifted a finger's width. She stopped and listened. Footsteps went past the door, slow and careless, then faded. She put the point back to the loop and worked with small patience. The bar rose enough to hang on the lip of the bracket. She eased the door in against its own weight. The lantern hissed, then steadied. She slid the bar the last inch and caught it with her palm so it would not fall. Cool dark met her when the door came free. She stepped into it and let the crack close behind her. The hall smelled of boots and smoke and old coffee. A fly bumped the wall and then went still. She moved on the balls of her feet, heel-lifted toes reading the boards. A board near the kitchen squealed. She avoided it. There was a hat on a peg with sweat salt crusted bright on the band. There were coats that had never been washed. She kept her hands near her sides and did not touch the wall. She counted under her breath until numbers stopped making sense. The yard opened around her like a pocket turned inside out. Wind came in clean and cold across the flats. Stars were salt-scattered hard. The dead cottonwood etched the sky. She crossed the porch and climbed down the 3 stone steps. A dog lifted a head and did not bark. It watched her with a tired intelligence that had given up alarms. She moved along the shadow of the house and then cut for the fence at an angle that kept her out of the window view. The wire was strung low. She went over the top rail with her belly tight to wood. The wire found her dress and raised its voice. She did not stop. Cloth tore. The sound was louder in her head than in the night. Beyond the fence, the ground pitched to scrub and cinder. Sage brushed her calves and signed its clean bitterness up her nose. The wind thinned and began to keep her warm. Rocks showed their backs like animals asleep. A thorn went into the meat of her foot and stayed. Another found the heel. Her breath shortened and stretched and shortened again. She did not look back. She ran the way a deer runs when it does not expect there is water ahead. She ran until the house disappeared into the plain and the windmill became a noise without a shape. The land gathered itself into a shallow cut, lined with juniper and stone. The air felt different there, as if the canyon kept its own weather. A horse snorted near the mouth of it. The sound was gentle and questioning. Leather creaked quiet and tired. Nora stumbled and caught herself on a root. Her vision narrowed until the road was a circle in front of her that moved. She saw a long coat, the fall of it the pale line of a horse's blaze. Cole Mercer slid from the saddle and set his boots careful. He lifted one hand open. The mare cocked an ear and breathed white in the cool. He took his coat and held it so it made a wall between them and the wind. He did not close in. He did not reach for her wrist. He waited until she saw him see her. She tried to swallow, and her throat closed on dust. She opened her mouth, and nothing came. Her knees gave at the same time that his hand found her elbow. He took her weight without making it a show. The coat settled over her shoulders and pulled heat out of the air. She did not look up long enough to see his eyes. She looked at his hands instead. They had the marks of rope and old work. They were steady because they had learned to be. He put her sideways across the saddle and swung up behind. His chest made a line of warmth along her back. The mare stepped into the wash and followed a path that had been worn into the earth by reason rather than by map. Cole cued her with a hand on the rein and his legs quiet. The canyon cut the wind. Canyon. The smell of juniper turned sweet and sharp. A coyote laughed far off and was answered by another shorter call that did not care to argue. The cabin sat between two ridges like a secret given to the right person. It was only 2 rooms and a lean-to with linen tacked where glass should have been. A small fire on the hearth held its orange the way a man holds breath in prayer without praying. Cole lifted Nora and set her on a narrow cot by the fire. The blanket was wool and old but clean. He moved without words. He filled a tin cup from a bucket and set it where her hand would find it. He put a folded cloth there, too. He took the leather pouch from his coat and set a jar of salve on the table. His knife lay beside it, blade, dull and kind. He stepped back so she could see the room and the doors and both windows. He let her know with his posture that nothing would happen she did not know about. She drank. The water warmed as it went down. The shaking left her hands in little shivers, like the last of rain off an eave. She lifted her foot and saw the torn pad. Blood had drawn a dark flower on the linen. She pressed the cloth there and then looked up at him for permission that he did not owe her. He nodded once and set his hand palm up slow and clear. Please. He signed the word with care so the shapes belonged to her too. Thank you, she signed back, awkward and careful. The movement lit a memory of a friend who had a brother who did not hear well. She had spent a summer learning simple words and then had let them rust. The shapes came back to her hands the way the names of constellations come back when an old aunt points and remembers. He crouched near the hearth and made a better nest of coals. When the water needed more heat, he set the kettle and watched it until it sang. He did not look at her feet until she had covered them with the blanket again. He did not look at her dress where the wire had made its mark. He made his body small in the room so hers could be bigger. When he stood, he found a heel of bread wrapped in cloth and set it on a plate with a wedge of cheese. He broke the heel. He put the larger piece on her plate and the smaller on his. He did not glance down as if he were measuring decency. He kept his eyes on the edge of the table and the iron that held it together. There was a coin on the sill with a notch cut through the face. Someone had worked the groove with a knife over long nights. Next to it lay a thin strip of willow with small lines scraped in a habit rather than a plan. Nora saw these things and understood something about the way time moved in this house. Cole rolled his bedroll by the far wall where he would be between her and the door without making a point of it. He unbuttoned his collar where the scar climbed from his chest to his jaw. It puckered the skin and then faded under his ear. He tried to clear his throat, and what came out was a rough breath that did not have a word inside it. He did not try again. He lifted his hand and shaped the words, "You are safe here." He signed them slowly with pauses that were not for him but for her to read. Nora touched the edge of the plate, then ate in small bites that asked permission for each swallow. The bread brought back a little strength, and with it came a weight she had been holding off. She set the plate aside and pulled the blanket higher. Her eyes closed when the fire shifted and found a new crackle in a knot. She slept because the body makes its own decisions when it has been told there is nothing else to do. When she woke, the light had turned gray and new. Smoke from the hearth wrote itself along the ceiling and then thinned. Cole was at the table mending a strap. He looked over and nodded once and then returned to the work. She found the water still there and the cloth rinsed and folded. She found a clean shirt folded near the end of the cot and realized it had been placed within reach, but not within assumption. She did not change. She held the shirt and let it warm her hands. He took her bandaged foot and checked his own work with a glance rather than a touch. He set the jar of salve beside her and let his finger circle the lid. Use when it pulls. He signed the words slow. She nodded. The corner of her mouth lifted and fell. She was learning how to let a small thing be a whole thing. He stepped out to the yard. Through the cloth at the window, she watched him move along the fence line with a hammer that had a cracked handle wrapped with wire. He pulled a nail that had lifted and set it straight. He tested a board with the heel of his hand and then left it be. The mare stood by the water trough and took her time with it. A dog that had found this place and kept it settled near the step and put its chin on its paws. The morning was cold enough to keep breath visible after the sun came up, so their breath drew small clouds that agreed to disappear. Nora found twine on a peg. She went outside and gathered sage where it grew against the fence. She wrapped the stalks and tied a neat knot. She hung the bundle beneath the porch where wind would comb it. The smell lifted the taste of rust out of her mouth. She wiped her palms on her skirt and looked at the sky as if it might have changed its mind about them overnight. Cole came up the steps and paused to look at the bundle and then at her. Approval was a small thing in his eyes and a full thing in his shoulders. He went inside and brought out the plate with bread again. The portion on her side was larger without ceremony. He set it on the rail between them and let his hand rest there for a second before he took it away. They did not speak. Their silence was not empty. The wind went round the cabin and made a note under the eaves. Somewhere on the ridge, a hawk rode a circle that did not hurry to close. By noon, the day had warmed enough to bring a smell of pine resin from the rocks. Nora swept the porch with a broom that had been made in a hurry and kept on doing its best. Cole checked the small corral gate and found a hinge loose. He went to the bench and chose a new pin from a tobacco tin, and then changed his mind and filed down an old nail to fit. He worked in a way that made the air calmer. The dog rose and gave a sound that did not belong to boredom. It pushed its nose toward the road and whined. Cole straightened. Nora set the broom aside and listened. The first thing was a faint tremor under the boards of the step that a person might miss if the dog had not said it. Then dust turned up from the far trail and stood like a veil. The dog barked twice and backed toward the door. Cole put a hand to the mare's halter and stilled her. The dust rose higher and began to hold shapes inside it. The sound of hooves rolled in slow, then gathered. The wind that had been kind all morning shifted and brought the smell of men and leather in trouble. The dust sheet held 3 riders. The first took the gate at a hard angle and sent a plank rattling. The dog bristled and barked raw. Cole left the mare's halter, came up the steps, and set himself between Nora and the yard without turning his head to mark it. She felt the shape of him close and still, and tasted metal at the back of her mouth. Wade Harlan swung out of the saddle before the horse had finished stopping. 2 men flanked him both with faces set to cruel and bored. Wade's coat hung open and showed a revolver polished by habit. His boots picked up dust and threw it off like they had never learned manners. "You keep something of mine," he said, and smiled without finding joy. "Bring her out." Cole did not answer. He let his hands hang easy at his sides and looked at Wade the way a fence post looks at rain. Nora stood a half step behind and to his left. She did not hide. She put a palm against the porch rail to feel it under her skin. Her heart had gone loud and slow, like a drum played by someone who did not care to keep time. Wade's eyes found her and pinned her as if he were choosing a calf. "Girl," he said, "you got lost on my land. You come back and learn how to stay." Nora felt the old instructions rise and tried to send them away. She kept her voice low and steady so it would not break on the words. "I am not yours." Wade's grin thinned. He lifted 2 fingers. One of his men struck a match with the pad of his thumb and breathed it to life. The flame caught a twist of pitch and woke brighter. The man tossed the torch into the dry mouth of the barn. The fire took like it had been waiting. Straw leapt to greet it. Heat moved across the yard in a wave that made Nora step back without thinking. Smoke rolled out black and oily. The horses inside went from restless to panic in a heartbeat. Hooves landed against wood. Iron rang against iron. A stall latch rattled and failed. Cole ran. He took the yard at a dead line and went past Wade so close the tails of their coats breathed each other's air. Wade swore and spun. Nora clutched the rail and felt splinters lift under her fingers. The dog screamed at the heat and then flattened to the boards with a whine. Inside the barn, the light turned to a living thing. It crawled up walls and sought the roof. The air hissed and roared. Cole pulled his sleeve over his mouth and nose and went straight for the first stall. A bay mare showed the whites of her eyes and struck at the door. He cut the lead with his knife and sent her out through the rear gate with a slap to the hindquarter. He did not try to speak because his throat would only give him pain. He let his hands and the pressure of his body say move. The second stall held a gray that had already bloodied his own face on the rail. Cole took his cheek against the horse's neck and pushed him left to make room for the knife. Rope gave. The gray bolted and nearly knocked him into the post. The smoke thinned and thickened as if it had thoughts. The heat took his breath and wrung it dry. A beam cracked above him like a rifle shot. He looked up and saw a line of light where there had been none. He backed and pulled the rear door with his shoulder. It stuck. He put both hands to it and shoved until his ribs burned. It gave enough to let two bodies pass if they did not mind what they scraped. He turned again and went for the last stall. Out in the yard, Nora ran along the side wall and found the rear gate with her hands. She threw it open and coughed on smoke that wanted a place to live in her lungs. A chestnut mare broke into the light and raked past her so close she felt the animal's fear through the air. Another followed and took the hill in a high run that had no grace in it. Fire snarled in the doorway and reached for her hair. She ducked and felt a bite of heat at her ear. Cole dared the last stall. The horse inside was young and dangerous and terrified. His hooves hammered a message that said no. Cole stepped in anyway and used his shoulder and his thigh to turn the animal's body just enough to let the knife find rope. He could feel the skin on his cheek take heat and hold it. He could smell his own coat char. The rope parted. The colt came up and struck, catching Cole along the ribs. He saw a flare of white and then black, and then he was moving, pushed by the animal's fear and his own stubborn will. He cleared the stall and found the open strip of daylight that Nora had made. He gave the colt his body the way a wall gives a drunk man something to slide along. They both went through and out into air that did not burn. The colt stumbled, then found his legs and fled. Cole dropped to one knee. He pressed his hand flat to the dirt because the world tilted and the earth was steadier than he was. Nora was there. She grabbed his arm and felt the heat in his skin through the cloth. His shirt had darkened where fire had licked it. His hair curled at the temple where it had singed. Ash clung to his jaw in a black memory of flame. She tried to lift him, and his weight resisted. He raised a hand and shaped a word without sound. Safe. He touched 2 fingers to his own chest, and then to the yard where the horses had run. They are safe. Wade stood 10 paces off with his face set to rage and calculation. The men at his sides shifted their boots like dancers who had forgotten the steps. The fire threw a skeleton of light across them. Wade looked from Cole to Nora to the barn, measured what he had set in motion, and did not come closer. He had the look of someone who cannot decide if the story has turned against him. He spat in the dirt and jerked his chin at his men. They mounted up without grace. Wade gave them his back as if the yard were not full of witnesses. They rode out the gate and left the fire to do its work. The dust that followed them tasted bitter. Nora helped Cole to the trough. He leaned on the rim and put his face to the water and let it cool him down to where he could own his body again. She dipped a bucket and poured slow over his shoulder where the cloth had blackened. Steam rose. He did not flinch. He did not reach for her. He held the trough with both hands and let her be the one who moved. The barn settled into itself and then down. The roof gave. A wall sighed and folded and threw up a fan of sparks that fell back to earth like a brief shower of bad stars. When the noise was only the small song of Cole's, Nora guided Cole into the cabin. She sat him under the window where the light was kind. She brought the jar of salve and clean water and a strip torn from the hem of the shirt he had left for her. She set her jaw so that her hands would not show the tremor they had saved for later. He watched her. His eyes were clear, past the soot. When she reached to lift the edge of his sleeve, he moved the cloth himself so she would not have to ask. The skin underneath was angry and raw in places, pink and shining in others. She touched the edge with the wet cloth, and he took in a small breath and let it out. The salve smelled of resin and fat and horse. She worked it into the burns with care that stayed true even when he flinched. Her mouth was a straight line. Her breath found a pace that matched the slow lift and fall of his chest. She set the cloth back in the bowl and sat with her hands in her lap. The fire had settled to a red lake at the hearth. The room listened. She did not look at him when she spoke. There was a supervisor at the convent school, she said. He came to my room at night. Her voice did not tremble. The words were sanded down to their shape. I told the Mother Superior. She said I was dramatic. She told me to keep silent because quiet keeps the peace. She looked at the wall at a nail that had been hammered and bent back straight. When my father came, I thought he would take me home. She twisted the strip of cloth without knowing she did. He signed papers at a hospital. They told me I was unwell. They tied me to a bed and poured medicine that made me shake. 7 months. When the money went bad, he sold me to settle what he could not pay. She stopped and put her fingertips to her throat like she could steady the past there. The room held both of them. Outside, ash drifted and laid a soft gray on the ground where the barn had been. Cole did not reach across the space. He listened in the way of someone who knows that listening is a kind of work. He stood after a time and went to the small shelf near the door. He took a flat piece of wood the size of his palm from a stack of kindling. It was a shaving off a walnut plank, dark and smooth along one face, rough on the other. He sat at the table with his knife and held the blade so the light could see the edge. He carved slowly, not because he wanted to be careful, but because the words were important and the knife was dull. The room filled with the small sounds of blade on grain. He did not look up. He made a letter, then another, the knife leaving pale lines through the dark. He blew shavings away with a breath that caught a little in his throat. He stood and put the wood in her hand. On it were 3 uneven words that held their ground. I believe you. Nora stared at them like they had a pulse. She brought the piece close and pressed it into her palm until the corners bit. Her face changed the way a window changes when rain begins. It softened. It cleared. It found a place for water. She bent forward and put her head in her hands and finally cried, not the mannered tears of someone who expects to be watched. She cried with her whole body. The sound tore free and then ran out, and then came again in smaller waves. She let her shoulders shake. She let the past move through her like weather passing. Cole stayed where he was and did not try to shape comfort with his hands. He kept his feet on the floor and let his presence be the proof that she was not alone in that room while she did her work. The crying eased the way storms ease. She lifted her head and brushed her face with the back of her wrist. She looked at the wood again and then at him. Her mouth tried for a smile and found something quieter and truer. She held the piece to her chest like it was a warm stone. Thank you, she said, and the words were simple and full. He nodded. He took the bowl to the door and stepped outside and tossed the dark water into the yard. Smoke had thinned until it was only a memory on the air. The wind carried a new scent that had nothing to do with fire. The first cold drop of rain struck the back of his hand and stood there like a bead of glass before it ran. The dog lifted its head and gave a low sound that was not fear and not comfort. Cole looked at the ridge line, then back to the open door and listened as the rain began to stitch the dust into dark patches on the ground. Rain stitched the yard into dark patches and left the ash smelling like coins and old smoke. Clouds dragged low across the ridge. The dog lay by the step with its head up and its ears working. Nora tied a fresh bundle of sage under the porch and pressed the twine flat with her thumb. Cole checked a hinge on the new corral gate and tapped a pin into place with slow care. The day felt held. The bark came sharp. Hooves answered. Dust rose where the road bent from the flats, even with rain working to keep it down. 4 riders came through the gate without asking. Wade Harlan led. His coat hung open, and the revolver on his hip rode easy. 3 men spread behind him, shoulders loose and hungry. They pulled up hard enough to make the horses throw heads. Wade swung down and left the reins trailing. His grin had no heat. He looked from the burned bones of the barn to the bundled sage to the woman on the porch. Bring her out, he said, voice casual, eyes not. Cole stepped to the bottom step and stood there. He kept his hands empty. He looked like a man who had chosen a place to stand and would not trade it. Nora moved up beside him until her shoulder almost brushed his. She set her palm on the rail where she could feel the grain. Her mouth felt dry and ready. Wade tipped his chin at her. You belong to me. This talk ends now. Nora kept her gaze steady. I am not yours. Her voice was clear. The words were not loud. Wade's smile thinned. He flicked 2 fingers. The first man drew a whip and snapped it once to wake the yard. The second slid a knife from a boot. The third picked up a length of hardwood and rolled it in his hands as if learning its balance. Cole did not look back at Nora. He took the yard in 3 steps. The whip cut the air and found his chest through the shirt, a line of fire and sound. He went in anyway. His left hand caught the whip near the handle and drove it down. His right hand took the man's wrist and turned it past what the joint wanted. The wrist spoke in a soft crack that was more speech than scream. The whip fell heavy. The man dropped to a knee and stayed. The knife came next, low and quick. Cole slid his step and let the blade pass cloth. He brought his shoulder across the man's ribs and rode him into the wall of the lean-to. The knife hand slapped wood. Cole pinned the forearm with his forearm and took the knife with his other hand without cutting himself. He threw it into the dirt where it buried to the hilt. The third man closed with the club. Cole turned with him and took his legs with a sweep that did not waste motion. The man hit hard the breath, leaving him in a flat sound. Cole stepped across him, caught the swinging arm, and locked it. The elbow had limits. He found them. The man screamed once and went still in the way of someone who understands the cost of moving. Silence held for a heartbeat while the barn hissed in the light rain. Nora stood at the rail with her hand closed on nothing. The dog paced a tight loop and stopped. Wade's face went from pleased to naked fury. He drew his pistol. He leveled it at Cole's back and took a step. The world narrowed to the circle of iron at the end of that arm. "Do it," Nora said. Her voice carried across the yard unrushed. "Do it and answer for it. The gallows take a man for less." Cole turned. He showed Wade both hands palms out. He put one knee to the dirt. It was not surrender. It was a mirror he held up so that the shape of the moment would be clear. Rain ticked on his knuckles and made small, bright marks. Wade's hand shook. His jaw worked. His eyes found the burned frame of the barn and the dark wet of the roof beams. He shifted his weight like a man deciding whether to end a story with a gunshot. Hooves thundered in the yard. Sheriff Ada Beckett rode through the gate with 2 deputies, the badge on her vest catching a smear of light through rain. She pulled her horse to a stop and held her rifle easy. Her hat brim sent water in a line off the back. "Drop it, Wade," she said. "Now." Wade did not move. Beckett's voice did not change. "You burned a barn. You brought men to threaten life and made good on it. I warned you last month. Put the gun on the ground." One deputy dismounted on the run rifle in the crook of his arm, eyes steady. The other moved along the fence line and set himself where he could see all hands. Nora stayed still. Cole stayed where he had kneeled and kept his eyes on Wade. Wade's breath made a sound as if it hurt him to pull it. He looked toward the road and found no help there. He opened his fingers. The revolver dropped and hit mud. It landed heavy and turned once. The deputy stepped in and towed the pistol away, then caught Wade's wrist and pulled it back. The iron cuffs closed with a soft clack. Wade's face went pale. He tried for a laugh and found nothing. The men on the ground did not resist when Steele found them. They had already done their resisting. People had gathered along the fence line without noise. Market day had sent folks on errands, and rain had sent them under hats and shawls, and the smoke from the barn and the sight of riders had sent them here. They stood with hands inside coats and eyes open. A woman from the bakery stood with flour still on her sleeve. A wheelwright had a grease rag in his pocket. A boy with a red kite on a stick watched from behind his mother's skirt. The kite line had been tied back together with a small knot. The boy tugged his mother's dress. "Why does the quiet man not talk?" he whispered. The mother glanced at Cole and then back down at her child. "He speaks with his hands," she said. "You listen with your eyes." Nora stepped off the porch and stood beside the sheriff. Wade twisted in the deputy's hold and spat words that had no point. Nora did not give him any more of her attention. She looked at Ada Beckett instead. "Thank you," she said. Beckett shook her head once. "Thank the rain for putting out the worst of it," she said. Then she lifted her chin toward Wade. "Take him." She spoke to her men without raising her voice. The deputies brought Wade through the gate and swung him into the saddle. They secured the others and tied their reins to the sheriff's horn. The small procession moved toward town with the steady pace of duty. The fence crowd drifted. Boots scuffed. Nobody raised a cheer. Faces turned home. The yard settled into the sound of breathing animals and rain on wood. Nora stood very straight until she felt that her shoulders could be her own again. Cole rose from his knee and rolled his shoulder once as if testing a hinge. Inside the cabin, the air held the clean edge of wet sage and the lingering sour of smoke. Nora took out the piece of wood from her pocket where the words had been carved and set it on the table. The letters caught a stripe of light and threw it back. She found paper in the drawer by the stove, the good kind with a weight to it. She brought the bottle of ink from the shelf and set out the pen. Her hand hovered and then sat down. Cole stood in the doorway and watched the rain. He kept his body where it would block anyone else before her and also where he would not crowd her. The dog curled near the hearth and placed its nose on its forepaws. Nora wrote names first. Aunt Margaret Hale Cheyenne, Clerk of Court Johnson County, United States Post Inspector Cheyenne Division. Her hand steadied on the second line. The nib scratched a rhythm. She told the story whole. The supervisor at the convent. The knock that came late. The door that did not keep him out. The office where she tried to say it and was told it was too much imagination. Her father's signature on a set of hospital papers. The straps. The medicine that burned her in the mouth and made the world tilt. The season of windows with bars. The ride to Pine Gulch with no bag. The paper Wade had waved in the air and called law. She wrote dates as well as she could. She wrote the names she remembered, and the rooms where the lamps had looked like eyes. She did not spare herself the details that proved her point. She did not open the places that belonged to her alone. Ink dried in lines that did not wobble. When the first sheet filled, she set it aside and began another. Cole crossed the floor and placed a clean cloth near her elbow without a word. He set a cup of water where she could see it, and then let his hands hang loose at his sides again. Nora signed her name at the end. Nora Hale Pine Gulch. She signed it once more the way she had been taught to prove herself when men had demanded proof. She sanded the ink and blew the grit off and stacked the pages square. The room felt taller. Cole put his palm to her shoulder for a moment and took it away. His touch was warm and steady. He did not look at the words. He looked at her face and found calm there and something else that did not have a name, but did have weight. She folded the letters and sealed them with wax from the lamp. She pressed the back of a spoon to the puddle and lifted it and saw the dull shine. She wrote the addresses. She set the envelopes on the table in a neat row. Evening had arrived without asking. The rain softened to a fine drift that turned the world into a room with no far wall. The sage bundle under the porch stirred and gave up its clean scent. The dog sighed once and was content. Nora drew the white ribbon from the pocket of her dress. The edge was still frayed from the market day. She smoothed it between finger and thumb and tied it around the jar of ink, neat and taut. She sat back and let her hand rest on the table. She looked at the letters and did not look away. Cole stood beside her with his shoulder almost touching hers. Their breaths found the same pace. Hoofbeats sounded on the road. Not many. A single horse at a steady official rhythm. It reached the gate and stopped. Rain ticked on leather and hat brim. A voice called from outside, clear and dry despite the weather. A man on a bay mare waited at the gate, rain puckering his coat. He lifted his hat with 2 fingers and spoke without shouting. U.S. Marshal, he said. Marshal Rowan Fitch, I have business at this address. Sheriff Beckett stepped from the shadow of the porch and gave a small nod. Her deputies had already taken Wade and his men toward town. She stayed because she knew there was more to finish. Inside, Nora set the pen aside and wiped a line of ink from her finger with the white ribbon. Cole stood in the doorway and watched the marshal swing down. The rain had turned gentle. It hung in the air the way dust hangs on a dry day, only cleaner. Marshal Fitch came up the steps and took off his hat. He smelled of wet leather and rode. Papers rode in a folio under his coat, the seal dark red and neat. He looked at Nora and not at her dress. He looked at Cole and not at the scar. He looked like a man who had read too many bad stories and still believed in writing them down right. You Nora Hale, he said. I am. He opened the folio and drew out a notice. The paper had weight and the ink was firm. He held it so she could read. By order of the United States. Summons and warrant for Edwin Hale on charges of trafficking in persons, obstruction of justice, and willful misdiagnosis for personal gain. The words sat heavy and calm on the page the way a shovel sits beside a hole. Nora read each line. Her hands did not tremble. Her mouth did not dry. She lifted her chin and nodded. Thank you, Marshal. I will serve him myself, Fitch said. Your letters helped set this in motion. He cleared his throat. Your statement will be taken in open court. Nora touched the white ribbon, then slipped it into her pocket. Sheriff Beckett gave her a look that was not pity and not praise. Cole stepped back to give the men the space of the doorway again. The marshal put his hat on and turned for the road. The rain laced his shoulders and did not seem to bother him. Days moved. The sky learned a lighter color. The ground drank. In town, the courthouse sat square and patient on its stone foundation. Its windows reflected the street like mirrors that remembered things. Nora came on a morning that smelled of wet rope and fresh sawn pine. She wore the white dress. The hem had been mended where the wire had torn it. The cloth was clean. The ribbon held her hair. She walked beside Sheriff Beckett and did not hold anyone's arm. Cole stood near the door among the men with hats in their hands and did not try to go farther. He set his shoulders where she could see him if she turned her head and did not ask her to. Inside the benches held ranchers and clerks and wives with work-rough hands. The baker from the market sat at the end of a row with flour on her cuff again, because flour lives in the cloth of bakers. The wheelwright had cleaned the grease from his fingers, but a black line still stained the nail. The boy with the red kite sat small beside his mother. The kite leaned against the bench with its knot mended and tidy. Edwin Hale faced the room from a table to the left. His hair had been combed. His suit had been brushed. His eyes could not decide where to land. He tried to catch Nora's gaze and found only his own reflection in the glass of the window. Nora took the stand. The clerk swore her in. She said the words with a voice that did not bow. She looked at the judge when she began. She did not rush. She did not ask permission from the shape of the room. She told the story. The corridors at the convent. A knock that had no right to be there. A door that did not hold. the office where her words fell off the edge of a desk, her father's signature on a paper with blank lines still left to fill, the straps, the medicine that made her swallow fire and sleep wrong, the months that did not count as living, the sale that was not a marriage. She gave the names she could. She gave dates where she had them. She did not open what belonged only to her. The room listened. A chair creaked and settled. Rain tapped a window and kept time. Sheriff Beckett rested her hand on the back of a bench near the aisle. Cole kept still by the door with his hat in his hands and his eyes soft and steady. When Nora finished, she let the last sentence sit where it landed. The judge did not speak for a moment. He wrote something small on a paper and folded his hands. A woman at the back stood up and came forward with steps that did not hurry. She took Nora's hand. She did not say a word. Their fingers held, then let go. Outside, the street moved around them without noise. The sky had pulled its clouds into high seams. Nora walked out with the ribbon bright against her hair. Edwin looked at the floor when the marshal touched his arm to lead him out a different door. He did not lift his head. The ride back to the ranch was quiet. Dust rose in soft ghosts and fell again. The dog met them at the gate with a small circle of joy and then lay down in the shade. The air held a sweetness that came from rain on dry earth, after it has had time to think about it. Nora went to the black foundation where the barn had stood. The ash had settled into a soft layer that held prints. She carried a small pouch wrapped in cloth that had once been her mother's. She knelt and opened it and took out sage seed. She pressed each seed into the soil with her thumb. The ash gave and took. The smell that rose was smoke and green together, a new thing made from two old things. Cole came from the lean-to with something long across his arms. He set it down next to her. It was a rocking chair shaped by his hands out of charred beams and good boards rescued from the fall. The grain ran dark and lighter where the fire had licked and spared and left marks. The legs were sanded smooth. The runners had been shaved until they moved like thought. He had made a back that would hold a body at rest and not ask it questions. Nora stood and touched the wood. The soot that lived deep in the grain did not come away. She followed the curves with her fingers and found the small letters cut under the right arm. She bent close. The words were there again, not even and not perfect and full anyway. I believe you. She placed her palm over the carving. Her eyes grew wet and then cleared without spilling. She drew a breath and let it out. Cole watched her mouth find a shape that did not need to be named. He held himself still so that the moment could own the space. They carried the chair to the porch and set it where the wind could find it. Nora tied the white ribbon to the window latch. It drifted in the light breeze and then settled. She hung a new bundle of sage on the nail near the door. The porch smelled like rain-cooled wood and green leaves and a smoke that belonged to a fire already gone. Afternoon leaned toward evening. The herd grazed beyond the fence and flicked their tails at nothing. A hawk cut a circle on the high air. The dog snored in soft puffs. Cole sat on the step with his arms on his knees and watched the line where the hills folded. Nora stepped close. She set her hand over her heart. She took his hand and placed it there, then lifted it and set it against his chest. He did not speak. He did not need to. He put his arm around her shoulders and held her in a way that felt like the right size. They sat like that until the light turned honey and then thinned. The first stars pricked through. Somewhere in the yard a seed took up water and decided to live. The chair moved a little on its runners and made a sound like someone breathing in their sleep. The ribbon at the window lifted and fell. The cabin held their quiet and kept it. The land held the promise without asking for more words. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story.